Brian. Good morning. It's time for today's AM Minnesota program. We are going to be discussing cover crops and soil health on today's AM Minnesota program. My guest, well, Ed and I have been friends for a lot of years. Ed McNamara, farmer over there in Goodhue County. And Ed, you're also, of course, very involved in the Goodhue County Soil and Water Conservation District.
Yes, Jerry, thanks for having me on. I've been on the Soil and Water Board since 1994.
So you've been involved for quite a while.
Yep.
Well, you were involved before you were a member
involved.
because you were involved in soil conservation
Right.
on your farm, knew it
Right.
was important.
Right, yes. Yes, no, it's been enjoyable, and I guess I have a passion for conservation, and I believe that we all need to take as good a care of our ground as we can possibly have because our livelihood depends on it.
And you aren't stretching it there. You lose your topsoil, try and grow a really good crop without good topsoil.
Well, yes, and anybody that's gone to the local garden shop and bought topsoil, 3/4 of a cubic foot of topsoil costs you $2. So,
When you start talking about losing a ton or so an acre,
a ton of soil on an acre is the thickness of a dime over a football field. And so acceptable T is considered to be, 3 to 4 tons per acre. I don't think we can afford to be losing that much topsoil every year. And you just look at the value of the soil plus your nutrient value, and since your livelihood depends on it, I think we probably need to start looking at our systems a little bit better to conserve that.
not just our livelihood, but our children and our grandchildren in terms of thinking about how long it takes for more topsoil to develop.
Well, yes, and the old adage is they're not making any more soil, and you look around the whole globe, the amount of erosion that's changed, and yeah, I mean, societies throughout histories have basically gone to war over finding better ground to grow a crop on.
Well, that's one of your most basic necessities, isn't it? Food.
Right. Well, yeah, you gotta keep the masses happy if you're gonna stay in power, I guess. So that's one thing about having a good being the breadbasket of the country, and we've been blessed. You look across the state of Minnesota, we have quite a range in soil types, in topography, and in moisture. And so with that also comes, when you start throwing those all together, now you have water quality, whether it's groundwater recharge or surface water.
Thinking about our weather these last few years, it's been so wet, some incredibly heavy rains. It really points out the importance of your erosion control in years when you have such big rains.
Well, yes, in that being able to for the soil to withstand those rain events has to lead us towards a different style of programming, and that's where we think soil, or for our soil health, having a cover crop on it will play an important part in that, reducing the erosion.
We didn't hear a whole lot about cover crops until 2 years ago when it was so wet in the spring, and we had a lot of farmers that couldn't get their farms planted, and so then to collect their crop insurance on a prevented plant, we had to plant a cover crop. And all at once since then, we've all learned a whole lot more about cover crops, and that's where all the interest has come now in the trying to figure out how we can incorporate cover crops into a normal corn soybean rotation, for example.
Yeah, back when both you and I were growing up on our dairy farms, we had cover crops.
It was alfalfa and some
well,
small grains.
The alfalfa was the main crop, and the cover crop was the oats that you either harvested for grain in late July or early August.
And to get the straw for bedding.
And the straw for bedding, or you took it for oatlage in June so that alfalfa plant would get going. Now I can remember going to extension meetings, and the extension specialist says, that's considered the oats as a smother crop rather than a cover crop because it smothered the alfalfa if you wanted to take it for grain. So that was part of the issue about trying to get that done.
Well, Ed, if you can stand by, we are going to have to take a break for the market. When we come back, we want to talk more about soil health and cover crop. But Ed McNamara is in studio for today's AM Minnesota program. Before the market break, Ed, we were talking about soil conservation and the importance of doing everything you can to hang on to your soil.
Yes, Jerry, that's part of where taking a look at cover crops again now with our current production practices, corn soybean rotation, possibly using the cover crop as a third cash crop. If you desire to plant a cover crop that could be harvested and sold to livestock, and if not, then to use that as a vehicle to quote unquote kind of shake loose the P and K out of the clay particles that those nutrients attach to, and that becomes available then when that plant dies and decomposes.
2 years ago, when we had so much prevented plant, and I'd never thought about it in this way, but one of the reasons that they wanted us to plant a cover crop, I was thinking, was just for soil erosion, so that there was something there. But they talked about all of that nitrogen that had been put on. Well, by the time we got to the next year, probably it was going to be all gone. But if you planted the right cover crop, it would utilize that nitrogen in the soil, store it in the organic matter in that plant material, and then release it the next year. So it was a way of hanging on to your nitrogen that you paid for and didn't need for the year.
Right, and also by hanging on to it, and you also tied it up enough to keep it from getting into ground and surface water too.
The problem, though, with trying to work cover crops into our corn soybean rotation is we're so far in the northern corn belt that once harvest is done, especially the corn, there's not much typically growing season left to get a cover crop established. And that's why we've started to do some research to figure out how we can do that.
Yeah, some of the research that's been done out of Penn State, and then also now up at the university with the addition of Scott Wells, who's come on board with the extension, is the development of a machine that would be able to plant a cover crop at about V5 to V7, which would be about the time that we would side dress our end, about knee high. And so that research, basically by planting it into the ground, you get a good seed soil contact, and you're at a stage of where the corn crop is going to start its rapid growth. So that
it's going to start to canopy.
It would canopy over, so that crop really wouldn't get much light, but it would still get a chance, to establish itself. And then when you hit that 20th of August, after we've black layered, you can start seeing, the crop starts drying down on the bottom, and so gradually there's less and less leaf area intercepting sunlight, and then the sunlight starts hitting those cover crops, and then they kind of start taking off again. So it's kind of it's kind of a dance that you're going to have to do depending on the year. Some years it's going to be too wet to do that. Other processes are trying to fly it on, and
well, they did that last year, that big demonstration at Jim Purvis's farm, and I was out there with the helicopter flying it on. I wasn't riding along, though. I was watching from the ground.
Right. Well, they wouldn't want the extra weight on it. They wanted to carry that in cover crops. But part of that is to be able to get an even distribution of that, because if you've got waviness, it's the same in your cover crop, you're probably not going to be able to maximize your amount of P and K plant to be taking that up if you have unevenness. So that's part of the trying to get a more even pattern across the whole field, so your whole field gets the benefit of the cover crop.
And when you have a field of beans, well, you can't really get much of a cover crop going before you're combining, because we're floating those heads right down on the ground. But maybe you get your beans combined very late September, early October. Maybe you could get a cover crop seeded in there, and it would have time to get established in the fall yet.
Yeah, and the other one that's has been somewhat successful is if you can get it on even enough to do it when the first leaves start to turn, then that, as the leaves all fall off, then that becomes a mulch that basically covers that rye, and then when it doesn't interfere with the cutter bar. Guys are nervous about that, but so far the research has shown that the cutter bar is green, but there's no green material coming through on the beans. And then when you're done, it looks like you've got a lawn out there, and now the sun hits it,
and away it goes.
I mean, if we start looking, I don't think we're going to be giving up as much yield as we think, planting in maybe like a 1-4 maturity bean versus a 2-1, you know, that's going to gain us almost 10 days. Well, 10 days on a cover crop growth is a lot of growth, and as you get that growth, you also get the root activity that's going to be capturing that N, P, and K.
Before we get too carried away, we better mention this big Southeast Minnesota cover crop producer meeting that's coming up next week.
Yep, next Wednesday, March 25th, over at the VFW in Road there.
Just look for the big Sherman tank out front, and you'll find
Sherman
it.
tank right next to the bridge at the river. If you get, you know, it's right across from the covered bridge that crosses it on the north side of Zimbrota there. We've got an agenda where we've got several University of Minnesota research people that have been working on it, forage and cover crop research. Jim Paulson, who's a forage nutritionist, is going to be talking about, you know, what's the value of cover crops to a dairy and beef cattle, and then, you know, if you are a corn soybean grower and don't have livestock, you know, how do you put a value on those cover crops when you're going to sell those?
Well, I remember my grandpa talking about plowing down green manure.
Yep.
That's kind of what same concept, isn't it?
Same concept.
Kind of funny, what goes around comes around.
Well, you know, we learn from our mistakes. Let's put it that way. And you know, that green manure. You know, you and I both remember. You know, our parents called it the soil bank program, and that's what it was. It's basically you used a green cover crop to enrich the soil, and that was always the next year. That was by far the best corn, and it didn't take as much nitrogen to do it because
you had it being released from that crop residue.
From that crop residue, and then it also fixed nitrogen in the soil. So you gain that, and then the soil structure, soil health. You know, that's another thing that gets into that. Our soils have become extremely tight, and that's also caused there's no pores for the water to infiltrate into the soil, so hence you have it running off, and if it's running off, it's taking soil with it. It's taking soil with it, it's taking nutrients with it. So by adding air pockets to that, when you do get a rain, now you've got an air pocket that water can infiltrate down into, and now that becomes available within the soil profile as opposed to running into neighboring streams now. Department of Agriculture has done some watershed monitoring, and then we have Kevin Keener is going to be talking on that down in the Root River, and he's had some edge of field monitoring that some interesting data showing, you know, what is coming off of those fields and how cover crops have, you know, changed that
equation, so to speak, of what's coming off.
Yep. And then we do have some farmers that have experience with cover crop. Andy Hart over by Elgin has done a lot, and Jim Purfis and Gene Kuntz here in Rice County out at Jim's farm there last year. They have the data that they collected last fall. And then Daniel Nath from NRCS down in Rochester, Mississippi River-based initiative. They've kind of announced phase 2 on that, and then that also pertains to soil health, and I guess, you know, the comment on that is soil health. You think of it, well, what's the first thing you do is, well, when you go to the doctor, they see if you have a pulse, and I guess, you know, soil health is that, you know, does your ground have a pulse? I mean, is
it alive?
Is it alive? Is it living? You know, is it? And that was part of the reason for the prevent plant, was that if you left that ground bare, there was nothing growing there for the fungi to feed off of, and so basically that ground got stale.
Well, then I also heard that if you had black soil, then the hot summer sun beating on it, the temperatures would get really high. Any sort of organisms you had there in the top few inches, you might be killing them off because it got so hot.
Right. And then when it did quit raining, then it got dry, and then you baked it. You know, and that was another reason that to have a live root growing on that. You know, it's you know, like our lawns. I mean, our lawns get dry, well, they're still alive. You know, but if it gets really dry and there's no vegetation on it at all, like a new construction site, it's very difficult to get stuff growing on that. And you ask any gardener that's trying to grow a garden, you know, you got to have some um, compost, you got to have some black dirt, and you got to put the two together to get it so it's becomes alive.
So it has a pulse.
So it has a pulse. Yeah.
Is there any cost to this Minnesota cover crop?
Yep. $5. That includes the morning break, the noon meal, and then the handouts that we're going to have.
You
so.
can't go anywhere and get a lunch for $5,
No.
let alone have a
No,
program and a lunch included.
Right. So you know we got our sponsors that are helping on that: Legacy Seed, Cart Seed, Byron Seed, Lacrosse Seed, Cosmos Seed, Minnesota Department of Ag, and then the Soil and Water Conservation Districts of Goodhue, Olmsted, Rice, Scott, and Wabasha counties.
I know it's really nice to see all of these SWCDs in southeastern Minnesota working together, organizing this, and recognizing the importance of it, and see what can we do all together rather than just in our individual county.
Right. And if you look at you look at those counties laid out, they go from east to west. And so they go from the river to the Minnesota River, and so we're covering two rivers, valleys. Major river valleys, Minnesota and Mississippi, and then also you just look at the topography, temperature, and moisture. They're all pretty close to the same, and so the goal was to have similar weather types, and similar topography. So when you talk to the group of people, you were quote unquote kind of talking to the same group of people. So
if it works in my farm in Wabasha County, it probably would work in my farm in Goodhue or Rice County or Olmsted.
Yes.
That's
the
logic behind it.
Yep, that's the logic behind it. So. Yep.
And then that's next Wednesday, the 25th.
Yes. Yep. So I encourage anybody, producers to call your local soil and water office because we'd like to get an RSVP here. So we make sure we have enough food for you, and I'm really excited about it. A lot of positive feedback. It looks like a really good program. There's enough professional people there, Extension and Department of Ag, plus having a farmer panel is always good because then now you got somebody that you can go up and talk to and ask questions. I mean, all these. We're leaving enough time on the agenda, for questions and answers, so people can, bring your questions because we've got the people here to if they don't have an answer, they'll be able to get back to you.
Well, it's nice, kind of the best of both worlds. You have researchers doing the scientific research, and then you have some farmers that have implemented that and probably
the
done
practical side of it. Yeah,
and probably implemented and tweaked it a little bit on their farm so that it might
right,
work better.
Right. And then, I mean, Andy doesn't have livestock, so. But he grows canning crops, and canning crops kind of, I don't want to say is the easiest way to get into cover crops, but it certainly becomes a somewhat easier avenue to get them established. Let's put it that way, because you got more time.
Well, I used to be really early with my peas, so then I would try and sneak in a second crop beans to see what would happen. Well, these last 2 years it's been later. You get into July, you can't try beans. Well, ideal spot then for a cover crop.
If you had a cover crop that would mature in the fall, that you wouldn't have to worry about terminating the next spring, you could actually, if you choose to, you could probably, find the right combination. You could harvest that for feed. You could sell that feed. So now you sold 2 cash crops in that year, plus you gain the root structure underneath, and then you have that mat ready to go the next spring then to plant into that. So it's going to hold your soil in place.
And a lot of sweet corn acres have been harvested by early to mid-September, even though usually they're pushing it almost till October, but there's a lot of acres that have been harvested before that.
Yep. And some of the discussion is for manure application, do you want to get a cover crop established and then go into that with a low disturbance airway type system for applying the manure, or get the manure injected in and then come back and get that field covered to a cover crop that would immediately start growing and holding that nutrients in place to keep it from dropping down through your soil structure.
And we've really developed a lot of technology and equipment too in terms of not disturbing the soil. Injecting manure, you think of the great big knife, almost like an anhydrous toolbar, only they aren't going anywhere near as deep. I even saw one once that had a big wheel with tubes that were sticking out.
Yep.
So it turned around, so
Yep.
you know, then you had a lot less soil disturbance,
Right.
but yet you were still able to inject the manure.
Right, and part of the thing now is, you know, you go a bigger bar and with the technology and the, you can basically, you can dial in, you can get a prescription to put on manure, if you know the analysis of the manure. As
Yeah, variability applied.
Variable applied based on soil types and the yield goals and where, you know, how much residue you got to work with to start with. So if you're gonna try to build residue and build soil, you know, you would try to put on, you know, maybe a different amount here, in the same way with the cover crop, put on a variable rate cover crop where you'd put on, you know, one type in a lower ground. You get up to clay no or something like that, you want to put on something that maybe has a lot more plant mass to it, so that when it breaks down, then it actually, you know,
You can enhance the organic matter in those spots maybe that have been eroded away.
Yep.
Because it's a long process,
It's a long
but
process.
you can still start it moving in the right direction.
Yep, you can start it by doing that, and managing the manure is the same as managing. Should be looked at as a waste. It should be looked at as a resource, same as NP and K. And so
I think it's better than NP and K.
Well,
there's something magic about it that these scientists haven't been able to figure out, other than just the basic crop nutrients in the manure. Maybe it's organic matter, maybe it's something else, maybe it's a slow release, but
yeah, it might be the biological activity.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, it's kind of the same reason. For how many years I was out in at George Washington's Mount Vernon, and he had a compost area that he composted, and then he took that compost up and he used that in his gardens, plantings, and basically that fed his workforce. And it was really kind of neat, you know. Okay, and then of course then he was on the Potomac River, and they would catch fish, and they would put fish in the barrels, and then they would ship, you know, salt it, whatever. They would ship that overseas. Well, they only did it twice a year, but they had to have all this help, you know, to do that. And then of course they all processed it. And it was really neat. And I could have spent another, you know, I was out there for a day, but I could have spent probably 3 days just going around the plantation, because he had areas where he diverted water to that he caught water. So he had basically a rain barrel. Rain barrel, yeah. And then so he used that.
He was so far ahead of his time.
Yeah, but I mean, you think, you know, because they talk about Washington and Jefferson had these conversations all the time. Now, I've never been to Jefferson's farm, and I think that'd be kind of interesting to see. But I mean, Mount Vernon was one that, so if I get back out there again, that to me would be, you know, very interesting. You know, you look at the founding fathers and the ideas that they had back then, and the knowledge that they had, and now you bring it, you know, a couple hundred years forward again, and we're still thirsting for that knowledge, you know, to do things better.
One of the major changes, we only have about 3 minutes left, but you talked briefly about it, the soil pulse. You know, is it alive? I used to think you heard about that, and it was kind of those fringe groups that, you know, I didn't put much stock in it. Now I'm finding out maybe they were onto something in terms of microbial activity, fungi, bacteria, that really make your soil alive and help break down that organic matter and do so many things that we kind of just took for granted and didn't pay any attention to them.
Well, you look at the amount of organic matter that we're putting back. I mean, we've gone from planting corn. I can remember planting corn at 22,000 plants per acre.
Now it's 38,000.
Now we're up to 35,000. So I mean, that's almost a 50% increase in organic matter. Okay, and for beans, I mean, beans. I can remember. I mean, this comment we were talking about the fire danger. I can remember when in the fall after we combined beans, raking all the beans up into a big windrow and touching the mash to them, and then we moved plowed after that.
I remember they did that on the corn. There was so much, so you burned it off so you could plow it.
Burned it off so we could get it through it. So I mean, you know, and that was, I mean, you know, you and I ain't that old, but I mean,
we remember that.
We remember that stuff. So now we've gone. I don't want to say to the other extreme, but we've.
I think it's the extreme, and it's a good extreme.
Well, we learned from it. We learned from it that by holding that residue and having it break down over time, rather than so fast, that we're able to basically mine the nutrients from the soil particles into the plant organic matter, and as that breaks down, that releases back that the new plants that are growing end up taking it back up.
Sounds like a definition of sustainable, doesn't it?
Profitable
and sustainable.
Yeah.
We only have about a minute left. Quickly, Ed, go through the details of that Southeast Minnesota cover crop producer meeting again.
Yep, it's next Wednesday, March 25th. Registration starts at 9:30 a.m. We're going to start the program at 10 a.m. sharp. It's at the VFW in Zimbrota, Minnesota, on the north side of town. $5 includes a morning break, the noon meal, and the handouts. Contact the Goodhue, Homestead, Rice, Scott, and Wabasha County Soil and Water. And we've got extension agents, 2 people from the University of Minnesota, 3 people from the Department of Ag. We've got a producer panel talking about their experiences with cover crops, and we have a representative from the Natural Resource Conservation Service talking about the Mississippi Basin Initiative. So.
And if you didn't RSVP and you find out at the last minute you can go,
you can
probably show up because there's somebody else that RSVP'd, something came up at the last minute and they can't go.
No, we're not going to turn anybody away that wants to come and learn about cover crops. So.
Thanks for stopping by, Ed.
Yep, thank you, Jerry.
Ed McNamara with the